I believe we are recording. So we're talking today about Hume's four essays, the Epicurean, the Stoic, the Platonist, and the Sceptic. These four essays first appeared in 1742. Some additions were made to the Sceptic in 1748, but otherwise they weren't changed much. The other three weren't changed much at all. And the cast of characters, if you will, are the four characters of each of the titles, plus, I would say, David Hume. Now, in a footnote to the first three essays, a footnote beginning each of the first three essays, he adds a kind of clarification or an additional description. The Epicurean, the man of elegance and pleasure, those are his italics. The Stoic, the man of action and virtue. The Platonist, or the man of contemplation and philosophical devotion. The Sceptic, he does not give an alternate name to. And then there's David Hume. And the first of these footnotes, where he first starts saying the Epicurean, or the man of elegance and pleasure, and then that footnote continues, the intention of this and the three following essays is not so much to explain accurately the sentiments of the ancient sects of philosophy as to deliver, I think that means enact or perform, the sentiments of the sect that naturally form themselves in the world. And I think he means even down to today, 1742, and entertain different ideas of human life and of happiness. I have given each of them the name of the philosophical sect to which it bears the greatest affinity. So he's not saying I'm capturing accurately the Epicureans of history and so on. In fact, I'd say, from what I know about Epicurus, I'd say it's pretty off, the Epicurean. But somehow he's using those titles to represent these different philosophical attitudes. Now, there are other footnotes. There are, first of all, the footnotes of Eugene Miller, who edited this volume, and those are in the square brackets, so those are modern. There are other footnotes that just give citations to some of the literary references that were put in there by Hume. And, whether to think of it as being the Sceptic or the Epicurean who gives that footnote, or David Hume who gives that footnote, doesn't matter so much, perhaps. But then, besides the first, these opening essay footnotes where he gives this information, that's clearly David Hume's voice. That's a little bit like Plato putting a title on his book. There's no character named Plato, but he does, as it were, give that piece of paratext, the title, and that's what David Hume is doing when he writes these footnotes. And then in the Sceptic, the fourth, there are two footnotes. And the second one, I think, is clearly, and the lengthy one is clearly Hume's voice again. So that's why I think, Hume is most certainly a fifth character in this cast of characters. A couple of textual things, just about the Sceptic, the last essay, to note. Again, there's no initial footnote giving an alternate name for the speaker. Now, that might simply be because the term Sceptic fits the old philosophical sect of the ancients and the modern apt term. So he just doesn't need to give a second modern kind of expression to the name. The Sceptic is longer. It's more than twice as long than any of the other three essays. And in fact, it's longer than the other three combined, which kind of is noteworthy. And the Sceptic has those two additional special footnotes, one of which is clearly Hume's voice, as opposed to the Sceptic's voice. Also, it happens that he revised it somewhat, added some paragraphs, several, like at least 3 paragraphs or so, whereas the others he didn't change. So the Sceptic sticks out, at least in those textual ways, as well as, I think, in other ways. Now, some textual marks about all 4. And so now we're getting more into the actual themes and stuff. Each seems to embrace at least some degree of philosophizing, maybe the Epicurean least, but the Epicurean even concludes with, an affirmation of philosophizing, at least to get to kind of his Epicurean attitude or outlook, it seems. They all seem to embrace virtue, or at least not to reject it. I think it's explicit in most. They all could claim consistency, I think, with affirming the holiness of the whole. That is to say, that sort of it's my responsibility to advance the good of the whole. I think they're all potentially consistent with that. I think some of them are clearly like even saying that. Now, the Epicurean, for example, is talking quite a bit about his own pleasures, but of course the Epicurean understands that he is part of the whole, so his own pleasures advance the good of the whole in that respect. In general, the 4 essays very much consistently suggest or seem to imply that people's well-being is mainly in their own hands, and that there's not so much scope for you to advance the well-being of others. None of them dwell very much on that at all. Some of them talk about friendship and patriotism and family a bit, but it's not, it's very much kind of about your own happiness is the chief thing that you can affect, perhaps, in terms of affecting the good of the whole. They all refer in some way to the divine God governing mind. None are overtly political. Now, I think you can use these, as Eric and Malta Dold do, to talk about paternalism, to talk against paternalism, just because of the richness and subtleties of happiness and of virtue. And I think that definitely works. I think that kind of virtue ethics in general speaks against paternalism, and it speaks against the governmentalization of social affairs generally when it's at all well done, virtue ethics of some kind. But none of them like come across with political overtones. Now, drifts and observations about all 4. Each voice expresses how he sees his own happiness as justified. You could even say in terms of the good of the whole. One thing you notice is that there's a kind of defensiveness about almost like asserting and justifying his own happiness and the way he pursues happiness, and even a kind of superciliousness towards alternate approaches towards personal happiness. Each disparages at least one rival as not true to virtue. And here I make some notes. Yeah. Now, a question worth thinking about is, can one find in each outlook ways for it to dovetail with one or more of the others? I think the answer is certainly yes here. And, I don't think Hume means to advance any one of the 4 as kind of like the way or the outlook. So that makes sense. And the way that each outlook has a bit of a crankiness or quackishness to it, maybe I should say crankishness, yeah, suggests that like, oh, if they just like open things up a little bit on some of their ends, they'll see that they kind of dovetail into the other and there's not necessarily conflicts and so on. And so you can take more of an all of the above kind of approach to some extent. Each's justification of his happiness relates to each's way of living happily. That is, his own habits of action and thought, his pursuits and inclinations. We get a feel for these, especially perhaps for the Epicurean, the Stoic, and the Platonist, but less so, I feel, for the Sceptic. Perhaps one point of the essays is to reveal that these two issues, that is, a justification of one's happiness and each's way of living happily, are not separable. So in other words, how you would justify your way, your own happiness would depend on kind of like your idea or your way of living happily. So it just becomes complicated where the two big questions kind of become one larger combined compound question. Each seems short, like I've mentioned, on advancing the happiness of others. They are very not enlightened-y, if you will. And that might be one way in which the David Hume, which is only meagerly expressed, would be rather different than any of the four. Since he's kind of doing a throwback to the ancients, you might just figure that the ancient intellectuals, philosophers weren't that oriented toward sort of guiding and leading and uplifting society. Some of you perhaps can speak to that. You might think that there's a bit of exceptions here, but I don't think they're very strong. It seems to be mainly about the happiness of the sympathizer, even when they do talk about some of these social duties. Anyhow, so to say a little bit more about the ways of living happily, the Epicurean first is very much feels that his true happiness is in experiencing nature in his sort of own very personal, unique, and rather sensual way. Art, human art, is only the underworkman. It's like not that big a deal or exciting or important. It's like watching my cat walk, or I've always felt this, watching my cat walk across the room is always like more, I used to have a cat, like in some sense more beautiful and pleasurable than looking at some beautiful masterpiece, so-called masterpiece of painting in a museum. So he's kind of just wants to be open and receive nature. And you get, this is a very difficult essay. I have a great trouble following it. And to some extent, it does come across as kind of a crazy guy, kind of a passage through life. This essay alone seems to follow the character through life with a sequence of life states. And some of it is this kind of almost orgiastic, like naked guy covered in baby powder with these cupids or God knows what, pouring oils on his head while he like spreads his limbs on his bed of roses. And then it like moves on, like where after he becomes sated with that and different attitudes and different characters, Celia appears and the muses. I mean, and these different voices and italics and quotation marks that reads like Shaftesbury, like I don't know what the heck is going on. But you get this kind of dreamily going through life, being open. All of these guys, I think, are kind of good, are good-natured. So they all are somewhat philosophical, and I think, decent guys, certainly not malevolent in their kind of feeling that they give off. Anyway, the Stoic is a big contrast here. Basically, nature urges man to employ his utmost art and industry in improving himself, and the Stoic makes very much of a kind of lifetime project of himself as a work of art and developing his virtue and being very careful and proud and of that, fulfilling all the different aspects of life, maintaining it, achieving perhaps a sort of glory for how fantastically and greatly he does it, and pursuing that is kind of his happiness. He goes on. It's also got sort of a kind of pride and arrogance to it. It's got some of the character that Smith perhaps caricatures the Stoics with, and so on. But that's very contrary. So he's like, I am to do the art that nature assigns to me. Whereas this guy's like, art is really like pretty secondary. He just wants to kind of respond to what he's endowed with, to appreciate life as it passes. Now, the Platonist is, I think, the simplest essay. It seems like the character is most straightforward and unambiguous. The Platonist says a rational soul made for the contemplation of the supreme being and of his works cannot ever enjoy tranquility or satisfaction while detained in the ignoble pursuits of sensual pleasure or popular applause. Compare the works of art with those of nature. So he too actually doesn't say very much at all in favor of art or of pursuing art, or for that matter, for even doing much of anything. The Platonist says nothing about doing art or benefiting others, not even as a means to exultant contemplation. Like, you might think that if you want to really appreciate the beauty of the world, you need to like explore the beauty of art just as a kind of, little platoon of the large, sublime, abstract beauties and objects. But he doesn't even say anything along those lines. The Platonists might strike one as a kind of escapist, excuse maker, phony, feckless pretender, protecting his selfhood with a supercilious attitude towards those who accomplish things, not someone you would want beside you in battle. By the way, I have doubts, to be sure, that Plato was such a Platonist. First of all, he was a man of action. He wrote a lot of great works, remarkably. So he didn't sit around just contemplating something. And I doubt that Hume thought that Plato was a so-called Platonist. Okay, now the Sceptic, it's not, you don't get that much of a picture or scene, I feel, of the Skeptic's, day-to-day activity. Like you kind of get the personality more of those, but here, so I don't really have a description of how he lives his life so much, but just some stuff about, and some note, it's a little bit more lengthy, about stuff he says. Again, it's the longest essay. It does make a kind of supercilious start, that is a kind of somewhat disdainful start, saying that philosophers, especially those who advance a system of happiness or virtue, almost without exception, suffer from a narrowness of principles and a narrowness of passions and inclinations. Life is agreeable in its turns. It's very varied. This is even true for the individual. Some you, kind of in the dialogue within the essay, says to the skeptic, but we come to a philosopher to be instructed how we shall choose our ends, more than, guidance on the means for attaining any particular ends. We want to know what desire we shall gratify. And the skeptic delivers his opinion, he says, but it's at great length and kind of belittling it, even though he goes on at great length. And basically he says, like, I don't think I can do much to change your desires or influence your desires. It's somewhat Stiglerian, George Stigler, you might say, like, first of all, he's talking about how the merit or value of any object arises, he says, merely from passion. Now that merely is very strong. He says these 4 words twice on that page. So happiness is a matter of one's passion and the enjoyment of their objects. I'm sorry, let me just get back to this. I just wanted to check something. You see, so it's about passions and enjoying the objects of the passions, like successfully getting to the objects of one's passions, and including the pursuit. I think he talks about as significant. But anyway, he says that some passions deliver more happiness than others. And so that's to a great extent what accounts for differences among people in their happiness, is just that some have kind of good passions and other ones bad passions, just in terms of like happiness payoff, if you like. And he's pretty fatalistic about it. At least he at the start, the fabric and constitution of our mind no more depends on our choice than that of our body. The ignorant and thoughtless are actuated by their natural propensities. Only a few correct their temper and attain the virtuous character and enjoy the empire of philosophy. Human life is more governed by fortune than by reason. So it's not totally fated. And he engages in some of his own quackishness or crankishness, where he says that the idea that you could raise up all mankind to virtue is impossible, and hence my conclusion is right. Well, your conclusion doesn't actually follow from rejection of that super strong claim. So I think Hume is not, painting the best picture of the skeptic. Let's see, he changes his tune a little bit, changes upon the temper and disposition suddenly presented as possible, at least for some portion of people, so man can improve himself. But then a sort of tenderness towards human experience, be whatever it is, tasting life. That is to say, then in the essay, and he is concerned that numbing wayward passions. So even if you try to improve yourself and control your passions, he makes this big concern about, well, if you do that, you're also going to kill what good comes from those passions. For example, if you become more open-minded, you might become less patriotic, like something like that. He calls disdainful philosophers hypocrites, those that look down on others, even though he's doing that himself in his own way by saying they're narrow in these different ways. He's saying they're hypocrites, though, because they too belong to common life and common sentiment, and they fall back into being just like everybody else as soon as life engages them. And then he moves into the 2 considerations that he offers that we can go into about kind of tempering life. Human life is not worthy of so much concern. Death treats alike the fool and the philosopher. He's got a little bit of what Wayne Booth calls the modern disjunction. He says, to reduce life to exact rule and method is a fruitless occupation. All right, well, what about like improving life with loose, vague, and indeterminate rules and method? He doesn't address that. He's kind of modernist disjuncture. Like if it's not precise and accurate, then it's just arbitrary. So he comes across a bit that way, to be sure. That's why I say, so he's got some overtones of Stigler without the nastiness. Yet to some tempers, to fix with accuracy life's just idea is one of the most amusing occupations in which life could possibly be employed. So he's clearly thinking of himself in the position to say this. So he must be one of these rare people who has this amusing occupation. A couple other things. So those are just, kind of pictures, character sketches, I guess you could say. I got just a couple other points still about them all. On upward vitality, kind of like, I want to be better than I was yesterday, or at any rate, better than I will be if I don't make a scrupulous effort, a vigilant effort to really think about my virtue, right? That kind of upward vitality, constantly, that constant aliveness, or self-improvement as a key aspect of virtue. What do they say about this? Actually, not so much. Generally, there's not that much emphasis at all on this. The Stoic speaks of oneself as a work of art and does make a remark about every day sensible of our progress. But the Stoic also says things that seem to express an attitude of having gotten to a pinnacle of virtue, the end of the road. Glory is the triumphant crown. This is the Stoic. The man of virtue looks down, and he's like speaking of himself here on this and that, assured of an immortal fame among all the sons of man, acquiring so invaluable a possession. So a very kind of proud, arrogant kind of feeling you get from the Stoic. The skeptic comes round to self-improvement, but after having sounded quite fatalistic about the possibility, as I noted, the misfortune is that this conviction and this resolution can never have place unless a man be beforehand tolerably virtuous. So he sees a kind of predicament or dilemma here, that the only way to get on any kind of upward path is already to be tolerably virtuous. So if you're not tolerably virtuous, you can't get out of being or not being tolerably virtuous. C.S. Lewis also has a passage where he says something about redemption, and he says you need virtue to do redemption, or pursue redemption. And so it's kind of, that's why he's got this very strong statement, C.S. Lewis, about people end up either on a path of virtue or a path of vice. Anyway, you get a little bit of that here. Hence, the skeptic is skeptical of philosophy being of use more than a few people. A question here, is each projecting their solution onto others, or does each speak only for himself? I think that varies. I don't think they are not all necessarily projecting their own ways of making sense of the world, like they're recommending it to others too, like every other anyway. So in kind of a summary, their attitudes toward virtue, I just kind of took a stab at this. The Epicurean, nature affords me pleasures and I receive them. Stoic, steeling myself to perfect virtue is my work in life and my happiness. The Platonist, contemplating divine beauty is my occupation and happiness. Skeptic, I pursue virtue because I don't have anything better to do, and I know it isn't for everyone. So here finally are Hume's closing words in that footnote when he lists all those other considerations that, can give you a certain temperance in life, or perhaps a little consolation, I think he says. So these are the final words of the paragraph there. When passion is awakened, fancy agitated, example draws, and counsel urges. I don't know what this means, but anyway, when passion is awakened, the philosopher is lost in the man, and he seeks in vain for that persuasion which before seemed so firm and unshaken. What remedy for this inconvenience? Assist yourself by a frequent perusal of the entertaining moralists. Have recourse to learning of Plutarch, this should be capitalized, the imagination of Lucian, the eloquence of Cicero, the wit of Seneca, the gaiety of Montaigne, the sublimity of Shaftesbury. Moral precepts so couched strike deep, and fortify the mind against the illusions of passion, but trust not altogether to external aid. By habit and study, acquire that philosophical temper which both gives force to reflection and, by rendering a great part of your happiness independent, takes off the edge from all disorderly passions and tranquilizes the mind. Despise not these helps, but confide not too much in them neither, unless nature has been favorable in the temper which she has endowed you. Well, all right, those are my opening remarks. And I think I shall stop the recording. Bye. Great. So reactions, comments. Eric, do you want to weigh in?
I'll say a few quick things. I really like these